Breaking news, a U.S. official tells ABC News terrorists have taken at least 400 people hostage in Pakistan.
Dozens of soldiers have been killed in Pakistan after a standoff between security forces and separatist fighters in Balochistan province.
Security forces in Pakistan say 190 train passengers have been freed after being taken hostage by gunmen in the province of Balochistan.
It was March 11th, 2025. At 8 a.m., the Jaffar Express left the station like it always did, heading toward Peshawar. It was a normal Tuesday morning in Quetta. The journey was meant to last 24 hours, passing through Balochistan's dry and risky terrain, weaving through narrow passes, deep valleys, and tunnels. The train was carrying around 440 passengers. Among them were families returning home, daily wage workers traveling for jobs, and students with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Also, a large but discreet contingent of security personnel. Some were Frontier Corps, others were regular soldiers. None were in uniform. That was the protocol. Rail travel was still considered safer than traveling by road, especially in this part of the country. But what no one realized that morning was that someone had been watching that train, monitoring it, planning for this very moment. As the train moved toward the Bolan Pass, a remote, rocky area with a long history of conflict, things started to feel different. At 1 p.m., an explosion ripped through the railway track. The train jolted hard, people screamed, then everything stopped. Before anyone could figure out what was going on, gunshots rang out, fast and loud. The train driver was hit during the attack and was initially reported dead, but later confirmed to have survived with injuries. The sound of gunfire bounced off the tunnel walls, making it hard to tell where it was coming from. Fear spread quickly through the train, and everyone was in shock. Within minutes, 70 to 80 armed men climbed onto the train. They carried powerful weapons, rifles, grenades, and even suicide vests. This was not a random act of violence. It was surgical, intentional, and clearly well planned. The attackers belonged to the Baloch Liberation Army, BLA, a group labeled a terrorist organization by Pakistan, the United States, and the European Union. But to many in Balochistan, the BLA is something else, a symbol of armed resistance against what they see as decades of economic exploitation and political repression by the Pakistani state. And now, for the first time in history, they had hijacked an entire passenger train. The train was stuck in one of the Bolan tunnels, an area with no mobile signals, few access roads, and surrounded by steep cliffs and dense terrain. It was the perfect place to stage an ambush and hold hundreds hostage, far from any immediate help. The BLA claimed they had taken 214 hostages, including active-duty security personnel, and were holding them as prisoners of war. At this point, Pakistani authorities hadn't even issued a statement. The news hadn't reached the public, but inside the train, passengers described doomsday scenes. One survivor, Muhammad Ashraf, who later made it out alive, said, after the militants had taken all the passengers hostage, they later began releasing those who were traveling with women and children. Another man, Hijack Noor, traveling with his wife and 2 children, described shielding his kids with his body as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls of the carriage. "If a bullet comes our way," he said, "it will hit us and not the children." By the evening, the militants began releasing certain passengers, Baloch, locals, women, children, and the elderly. Many of those freed walked for hours through the night, climbing over rocks and crossing dried riverbeds to reach the next railway station. But most of the hostages, especially the soldiers, were still being held. For the BLA, this was more than just an attack. This was a message, a display of force and control. And the target wasn't just the Pakistani state. It was the narrative, the idea that the government was in control of Balochistan. That night, as news finally began to surface, the scale of the event became clearer. This wasn't a bombing. This wasn't an ambush. This was a hijacking. Something almost unprecedented in Pakistan's history. It showed weaknesses that had been ignored for too long. By the early hours of March 12th, Panic had spilled beyond the mountains of Balochistan and reached Pakistan's highest offices. News outlets had picked up the story. The BLA wasn't silent. They released a formal statement, broadcasted through encrypted channels and messaging groups, with a 48-hour ultimatum. Their demand was straightforward: release all Baloch political prisoners, activists, and missing persons, or they would begin executing hostages, starting with the military personnel. It was a bold challenge. According to the BLA, civilians, women, and children were being released in stages as a show of war ethics, but the rest, soldiers, intelligence officers, paramilitary troops, were being treated as prisoners of war. Now, the Pakistani government faced a tough choice. Should they talk to the militants, something they had always refused to do? Or should they send in the army and risk many lives? This wasn't a normal hostage crisis. The area was rough and hard to reach. The attackers had heavy weapons, and some of them, officials said, were wearing suicide vests while sitting next to the passengers.
जैकेटें पहनी, वो जैकेटें जिस तरह ये हमारे नहीं पहनते ये आर्मी वाले, वो प्लेट वाली, वो जैकेटें थी और उसमें मैगजीनें थी, खुले राउंड थे, तो लाकड़ रेंजर वाले के पास वो लंबे लंबे वो लाकड़ रेंजर का होता है वो गोला वो थे, ऊपर हेलीकॉप्टर चक्कर लगा रहा था, दूर से वो फायरिंग कर रहे थे एफसी वाले, करीब कोई.
One wrong move, and it could all end in disaster. Inside the train, the situation was growing more desperate. Survivors later talked about the hunger, heat, and fear they went through. There was no air conditioning, no food or water, and armed men kept watching every move. People were exhausted and starting to break down, and it was like doomsday.
क़यामत का मंजर था. आप 40-42 घंटे ना आपके पास पानी हो, ना आपके पास खाने के लिए कुछ हो, आप धूप में, सहरा में, तपती धूप में आप ज़मीन पे पड़े हो. किसी को, इंसान को सर उठाने की इजाज़त ना हो. अगर कोई सर उठाता है, कमर ऊपर करके देखता है सर, तो उसके सर में गोली मार दी जाएगी. कोई इंसान किसी के साथ बात नहीं कर सकता, साथ साथ होते हुए.
People clung to each other in silence. Some whispered prayers. Others whispered their names to strangers, just in case they didn't make it out. In the chaos, parents tried to protect their children with their own bodies. People watched in fear as the attackers walked through the train cars, calling out ranks, checking ID cards, and pulling soldiers away from the rest. It was clear. This wasn't just a hijacking. They were targeting specific people. The attackers knew exactly what they were doing and why. The Baloch Liberation Army, or BLA, claimed responsibility just hours after the train was hijacked. And with that claim, they made something clear. This was a political act. The Jaffar Express wasn't chosen at random. On board that day were not just civilians. At least 100 plus of them were believed to be active duty soldiers and paramilitary officers, traveling discreetly from Quetta to Peshawar. For decades, Balochistan has burned beneath the surface. Despite being Pakistan's largest province, rich in gas, minerals, and coastline, Balochistan remains the country's poorest and most neglected region. The people there have long claimed they're treated as outsiders, exploited for their resources, ruled by force, and silenced when they speak up. Thousands of Baloch people have gone missing over the years. Many blame Pakistan's security agencies, and many of those who return, if they ever do, come back broken. The BLA's statement didn't just reference this history, it leaned into it. They called the hijacking a tactical response to decades of oppression, a way to show the state that its power was not absolute, that even a moving train, deep in its own territory, could be stopped and taken. At a press conference days after the siege, Army spokesman Lieutenant General Ahmed Sharif Chaudhry admitted the obvious. This attack has changed the rules of the game. But while officials pointed fingers, blaming India, Afghanistan, and the usual foreign hands, they avoided the one thing that might have de-escalated the crisis: addressing the demands. By the second day, March 12th, Pakistan was in full-blown crisis mode. The media was showing haunting images of wooden coffins being loaded at Quetta railway station. Some channels said the militants had started executing passengers. Others claimed a secret negotiation was happening behind the scenes. The government? Silent. After that, a few groups decided to take their chances and run. According to people who were there, after hours of hearing gunshots and seeing passengers being taken away, it became clear: staying meant dying. One man who managed to escape said,
जैसे वो चांद नीचे पहाड़ों के नीचे गया ना, तो अंधेरा छा गया। जैसे अंधेरा छाया, हमने बोला इन्हें तो मार तो देना ही है, छोड़ ही नहीं रहे, किसी को भी नहीं छोड़ रहे। वो 10 की टोली में, 15 की टोली में, 20 की टोली में, 3 की टोली में, ये भी उठो, उधर जाकर डालता।
In the early hours of March 13th, after more than 36 hours since the hijacking began, the final assault was launched. Helicopters circled above. Elite units stormed the train, carriage by carriage. They had orders: rescue who you can, eliminate every militant. It was fast, precise, and deadly. According to their report, 354 passengers were successfully rescued from the hijacked Jaffar Express. However, the operation came at a heavy cost. A total of 26 hostages were killed. Among them, 18 were soldiers and 5 were civilians.
Saying that the operation had concluded, that there were 25 people who had been killed, including 4 from the security forces.
In the fierce exchange of fire and during the storming of the train, 33 militants were reportedly killed.
All 33 assailants were being killed following a 30-hour siege.
5 soldiers from the Frontier Corps also lost their lives in the operation. But the Baloch Liberation Army wasn't going to stay quiet. In their counter-statement, they accused the army of lying. According to them, they had executed 50 hostages, not 26, after the government refused to negotiate. They claimed the army didn't rescue most of the hostages, that those people had been released intentionally as part of the BLA's war ethics. And most shockingly, they said they still had control of parts of the area and the train when the government claimed victory. At this point, it became a war of narratives. Pakistan's government was trying to show strength. The BLA was trying to prove dominance. Both sides accused each other of twisting the numbers, hiding the truth, and using the media for propaganda. And the actual death toll? Still unclear. What happened on the Jaffar Express was the result of years of silence, suppression, and simmering resentment. Over the years, peaceful protests in Balochistan were crushed. Activists disappeared, and when the dialogue ended, the guns started talking. That's where groups like the Baloch Liberation Army stepped in, a militant outfit that claims to fight not for chaos, but for liberation. And they've been building for years. Back in 2019, they attacked the Pearl Continental Hotel in Gwadar, a high-end hotel where Chinese officials were staying. Their goal was to disrupt the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. It's a massive project worth billions, but many people in Balochistan see it as another way their land is being used without their say. A year later, they attacked the Karachi Stock Exchange. Then in 2022, something even more shocking happened. A suicide bombing at Karachi University. It was carried out by a woman named Shari Balochistan. This was the first time the BLA used a female suicide bomber, and it shocked the whole country. But they weren't stopping. In early 2024, the group launched a major attack called Operation Dara-e-Bolan. Hundreds of their fighters took part, and for a short time, they took control of around 70 kilometers of important land, including a key road used by the military to move supplies. Each attack was more organized. Pakistan hit back with force, airstrikes, raids, and arrests. But instead of ending the problem, it made things worse. Every crackdown made people angrier. Every raid pushed more young men to join the fight. And now, with the hijacking of the Jaffar Express, the message was loud and clear. The insurgency wasn't dying. It was growing stronger. As soon as the Jaffar Express operation ended, Pakistan's military turned to what it usually does after a major attack: blame the neighbors. ISPR DG says India directly sponsored Jaffar Express hijacking. According to both the military and the Foreign Office, India has been funding and training Baloch insurgents for years. They brought up old statements by Indian officials, the controversial case of Kulbhushan Jadhav, and what they described as a long-term strategy to destabilize Pakistan from within. India called the allegations baseless. They fired back with their own, that Pakistan is the real hub of cross-border militancy. And then there was China, silently watching from the sidelines, but clearly nervous. With billions invested in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, Beijing pressed Islamabad to tighten security, especially around its workers and construction sites. There were even whispers that China wanted to send its own troops into Pakistan, something the Pakistani state hasn't allowed, at least not yet. The Balochistan conflict had become regional. Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, China, all tangled in a crisis that's no longer just about land or politics, but about power, influence, and control. In the days after the hijacking, people expected the government to finally address the root of the crisis, to open dialogue, announce reforms, or at least acknowledge Baloch grievances. But that didn't happen. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif held a high-level security meeting and said Pakistan would confront terrorism with the full force of the state. That was it. No plan. No political roadmap. Instead, the military launched more operations in Bolan and nearby areas. They called it a sanitization campaign, a term that for many in Balochistan means house raids, arrests, and people disappearing overnight. State media kept praising the military's success, but the cracks were showing. That's when Akhtar Mangal, former chief minister of Balochistan, said what many already feared. There is not a single inch of Balochistan left where the government can claim authority. They have lost this war, completely and irreversibly. The army took back the train, but the province is slipping. Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.